So just in terms of what we're doing here, I'm here with Simpact's COO, Laura Dixon, who's at the back there. And so Simpact Strategy Group is all about looking at this idea of measuring social impact. So on one side of the business, we work a lot with community organizations and different funders to do social return on investment. We do capacity building, we do individual projects and consulting. Then on the other side of the business, we work with about 50 big corporations in Canada through the LBG Canada benchmarking process to help them understand the value of their community investments and help them audit their community investment data. And so we kind of get both sides of the picture, which is always really exciting. So we've seen a lot of interest from a lot of different sectors in social return on investment. It's coming from funders who are looking to value the investments that they're making. It's also coming from the public sector. It's coming from individual projects who are really excited about showing the value of the things that they're doing. So we're seeing it all across the board. So today, well, this is kind of a brief overview of what SRI is, what the process is. I'll talk through a few examples of some of the work that we've been doing and the different ways that SRI is being applied. And then I'll speak to the project that's happening right now in St. John. So social return on investment kind of takes a broader look at value than just cost savings. So it's moving the conversation from just the conversation about costs and moving it to the conversation about value and about social value. And so it kind of goes beyond this idea of a cost-benefit analysis in three main ways, I would say. First, it takes a broader look at value. So you're looking at environmental value, you're looking at social value. You're taking a broader look at that sort of value. Second, social return on investment is very, very interested in making sure that value is demonstrated from the stakeholder's perspective. So from each individual stakeholder that's identified in the analysis, we'll seek to value from their perspective and make sure that the value to participants is also being represented in that analysis. And then thirdly, SROI allows for the valuation of avoidance of alternative outcomes. So if you're valuing outcomes that are created, it's also possible in the social return on investment methodology to say if someone wasn't involved in this program and some alternative path was taken, what's the value of avoiding that alternative path? And that's part of the value that's created through the outcomes that are achieved. And overall, it's this idea of being able to communicate in a different way about the good social value that's going on in the community. So being able to speak a language that funders are speaking, that investors are speaking, that community organizations know are happening, but they're less able to speak that language. So it's kind of translating that good work into a language that other individuals can understand. So this is just kind of a summary. You can be communicating, you can be evaluating what's going on in your program and improving processes through that. You can be forecasting value and understanding the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve, figuring out how to measure those outcomes that you're seeking to achieve, and then assigning value to them. And you can also be making business cases for investment by using this type of language. And I think in this slide, I'd just like to highlight that an SRI is not just that ratio. It's not just you do all the calculations, you get a ratio, and you show somebody, you say, it's great, it's 3 to 1. It would be like somebody coming to you and saying, do you want to buy this house? Here's the price. And you would say, well, what neighborhood is the house in? How many bedrooms does it have? Does it have a backyard? You would want to know the context. You don't just want to know that number. You want to know the whole context of that story. So the number can be the hook. It can also be a demonstration that outcomes are happening, that you're achieving the things that you're seeking to achieve, but it's not just about that number. So in terms of the actual SRI process, and I know Penny kind of got into this a little bit this morning, and so we'll just talk a little bit about it now. The process seeks to answer certain sort of fundamental questions, and it starts with kind of evaluation questions. So the who changes, who are those stakeholders, who's experiencing change? Is it just your participants? Is it broader than that? Is it the government? Is it your community? Is it the family members of participants? So seeking who those stakeholders are, and then asking the question, how do they change? So what are those outcomes that we're seeking to value? Then looking at the idea of, okay, we know the things that are changing and the things that we want to recognize that are changing. How are we going to measure that? How are we going to demonstrate that those changes are actually taking place? So looking at the measurement. So that's all kind of outcomes-based evaluation. And then the SRI methodology takes it another step and says, how would you then value those outcomes that you've identified and that you've measured? And it also ensures that there isn't overclaiming, in that you discount for recognizing that maybe some of that change happened because of other factors. Maybe some people would have made that change anyway. Maybe there were other programs contributing to that. Maybe you've displaced something else positive in the process. So SRI also ensures that there's no overclaiming by discounting all that value based on looking at these other factors. So when you go to do an SRI, there's 6 steps involved in the process. You look at who those stakeholders are, what your time frame is, what the scope is, and then you go in and map what those outcomes are based on the scope that you've established. Then you go in and measure and evidence those outcomes and assign financial value to individual proxies. Then you start asking those questions, were these outcomes entirely because of our program? Were there other negative unintended consequences, that sort of thing, and you discount those outcomes that you've looked at. Then you do the calculations in terms of the investment in and the value out, and then you can communicate all the things that you've done. And you can embed it into your process so that you're able to improve different program practices. For example, one program that we worked with it was a youth health center, and they do all sorts of things around homeless youth and helping them with all sorts of different issues. And one of the things they said that they did was they go to a remand center and they help youth that are coming out of remand, help them reintegrate into the community. And they said because of that, they're not offending as often when they come back out into the community. So their recidivism rates they've dropped off entirely. When we actually went in and measured, it wasn't true at all. Every single one of the youth that they'd worked with had reoffended within a year. And so they were really, really surprised about this because they didn't know that. And they were able to then say, if this is an outcome that we're seeking to achieve, how can we change what we're doing to actually ensure that we're achieving that particular outcome? So it can help with that process improvement on an ongoing basis. When we're looking at readiness for SRI, from the funder's perspective, it's all about understanding that it's not all about that ratio. It's having the internal capacity to understand the results when they come back to the funder. And it's also ensuring that the agencies that they're funding are supported in that SRI process. And I think they really saw that in Newfoundland, where the provincial government really invested in that capacity building and really invested in making sure that the agencies that they were working with were going to be able to do this in a very serious way. From the agency perspective, if you've already got an outcomes-based evaluation model, you're much more ready to start to take that next step into SRI than if you're just measuring activities and outputs. As well, if the agency is ready to be engaging stakeholders and ready to be asking the right questions of those stakeholders, they're much more ready to be going down that path of SRI. And I think there also has to be a willingness within the agency to do that process improvement, to say, if we find something that isn't working, we're actually going to improve our process, to not be scared to ask the questions because you're worried about finding those results, but to say, if we find these results and they're not what we're hoping for, we're going to make some changes and we're going to do these things. So that's the very, very brief overview of how SRI kind of works. I'll walk through a few different examples, and then I'd be really happy to answer as many questions as possible or have a discussion around social return on investment, maybe what you've heard already earlier in the conference, and we can just kind of talk through it a bit. So social return on investment can be that individual project SRI, where you can go in and if there's evaluation data and you're measuring different things, you can do an evaluation. and look at what the value has been and continue to do that year on year to see what it looks like each year. There's also the possibility to do kind of a hybrid evaluation forecast where maybe you're measuring some of the right things right now, but there's a few things that you haven't been measuring but you need to go into that SRI analysis. It won't prevent you from doing an SRI. You can estimate those or forecast them in the first year or two until you're starting to get that data in. And in the meantime, develop the right evaluation tools to get the right data for your analysis so that you have that full, robust analysis. And there's the possibility to do a complete forecast SRI, where you look at best practice, you look at other program results within your community, you look at the things that stakeholders are saying about the changes they're expecting, and you're able to forecast that value and see what that's going to look like when you start doing your activities. And then afterwards, you can take that forecast and see if you were right. You can start measuring the right things for that model, and then put your evaluation data in there if your project gets started, and see if you actually achieve the value that you thought you were going to achieve, and maybe you're exceeding it. We've also seen some kind of different interest in SRI, and the city of Calgary actually asked us to come in to do a really interesting project where their asset management department took a look at an inner city recreation center and said, this is an old building and it's really costly to run it. We should rip it down. And maybe we'll go and build something new in the suburbs, or maybe we'll build something new there, in a few years, but it's costing us some money, let's rip it down. When we looked at it from that broader perspective of social return on investment, and you look at the types of individuals that are using an inner city recreation center, it was a lot of low-income seniors in the area who didn't have cars, weren't going anywhere else, but would walk to their recreation center once a week to go swimming. There were also some programs being run there for at-risk youth, for youth who would have otherwise, after school, had no other place to go. And so when it was taken into account that there's social value to having individuals have access to that recreation center, it actually changed the decision of the asset management department, where they said, yes, there's a cost to running this asset, and it might be more costly than some of our other newer assets, but there's also a huge social value that outweighs that cost, because there are all these other activities, these social activities that are going on in this particular recreation center. So it's just a different way of thinking about value in a community. There's also been work done to take a look at SRI across multiple programs. This is an image from a report that came out in the UK last year, where they wanted to look at what the value of some of their women's services were in the community. So they took a few flagship projects and did SRI with them, but they actually spoke about the value across those programs. So they didn't say this one program or this other program is better or has more value. They said, we know women's services are valuable. What does that range of value look like in our community? We've done some similar work recently with the region of Waterloo, looking at a strategy to prevent persistent homelessness. So they fund a whole bunch of different programs, and they said, what if we looked at SRI in a few of these different programs for key different demographics, so women, youth, and 2 different men's shelters, and we look at the value of preventing persistent homelessness in our community, and then rather than saying, okay, the youth one got the highest ratio, we're gonna only fund youth homelessness, that doesn't really address what homelessness is in their community, but they said addressing persistent homelessness has this range of value in our community across different types of demographics and situations. There's also kind of the next level up, looking at the policy level discussion around social value. The City of Calgary has been very interested in this in terms of their family and community supports. And the government of Scotland actually did a really interesting thing where they were looking at kind of that idea of our government needs to save money someplace. What about social housing? And so they took a look at that and they said, is it really possible to take out that chunk of budget and spend it someplace else? And when they looked at the social return on investment of social housing, they actually saw that it creates a huge amount of value in their community, and taking out that piece of the funding would really end up putting a lot of pressure on a lot of other systems. It would end up costing the government a lot more in a lot of other places. So they were able to change that policy and continue to move forward with social housing rather than taking that particular chunk of money out of their policy budget. In the province of Alberta, there's been a lot of SRI work, and we've worked really closely with the Department of Justice to help them do SRI for this range of investment. So our current premier, when she was the Minister of Justice in Alberta, she helped pull together $60 million across a few different ministries, so health and education, to say we're going to invest in crime prevention, and it's going to touch all these different ministries, and we're going to invest in these pilot projects to see how they do and see if this has an impact in our communities. And they asked every one of those 88 projects to also do a social return on investment analysis. So we've worked with those projects to provide training, to provide coaching, to provide the tools to do these social return on investment analyses, and they've actually now been able to say what that $60 million means. It means savings in all those departments, in education, in health, in mental health, and they're able to speak about that range of investment. They've also been able to set those programs up, since it was only pilot funding, they've been able to set them up with something that they can move forward with to look for the right funder. And they've also been able to identify some programs that didn't get organized well enough to provide results at all. So, and that's part of their evaluation more generally. But it was this broad project of capacity building. So all those individuals are moving forward with that capacity to do SRI and to think about those things. But also, it was a project around being able to communicate value horizontally across those different departments, and identify financial proxies that would touch those different departments or be useful for different types of projects. So it's coming to your community too. We're doing some work right now in St. John with a program called First Steps. Does anybody know this program? We've got some people who know this program. And so it's a program that provides residence, school, daycare for young women, so women under 29 who are pregnant and parenting and who don't have anywhere else to go. They've been living on the streets, they've been couch surfing, they're homeless or very, very close to homelessness. And so the program provides them with a safe place to live, food while they're pregnant, school for the women while they're living there, daycare, a child development program, and then it also has a piece that's about finding women independent living situations afterwards. So they have a Second Steps apartment program where they can continue to be in touch with the women and help them with life skills development and different things as they move forward. And so the idea behind this is this idea of breaking a cycle of poverty, where if you're able to address these vulnerable young women, it has ripple effects for their children and then eventually their children's children. If these women finish high school and they have a safe place to live while they're addressing different issues in their life, then they're much better able to have a healthy pregnancy, they're better able to find a job afterwards, they're better able to support their children, and it has huge value in their community. So we've worked together to put in a proposal to HRSDC to do some research, and the research project is this social return on investment. We're working with them to develop their evaluation tools, to use the data that they already have to feed into the SRI, to do research around their financial proxies, and to do an analysis of this program and to see what the social value is of this program and to help demonstrate what that is in the community of St. John. And it kind of stems out of this idea that there is value to reducing poverty and there is a cost to individuals being homeless, but it's a broader look. We're working really, really closely with all the women in the program. I was actually there yesterday, and I think I interviewed more than half of the women who are living there, talked to all of the staff, and social return on investment is really looking at what are those outcomes for individuals in the program. Let's ask them about it. Let's ask them about what's most valuable to them and make sure we're valuing those things. And then being able to speak to that when we're talking about the St. John Poverty Reduction Strategy and what the value of then investing in that program is. So again, it's kind of that whole, it's a story, not a number. You do get a number at the end. There are all the metrics behind it. There are all the calculations. But it's really also about being able to better communicate the good work that's going on in the community and the implications of that work. So we also got funded by HRSDC to ask individuals who have done SRI what their experience has been in Canada. Most individuals have said that it's about that communication piece. Interesting to me, I think, is that there was also an increase in staff morale, where staff started to feel that they were better able to communicate about the value of the work that they were doing, and they felt really, really proud about that. We also asked around some of the challenges to why individuals weren't pursuing SRI, or sort of the barriers that they might see. And what we really saw, it wasn't around not understanding outcomes measurement and not wanting to go down that path. It was more around not having the funding or the capacity, the evaluation capacity within their own organization to be doing that work. So really looking to those funders to understand that if they want to see these types of results, they need to also fund that type of analysis. And just in terms of resources out there, SRI Canada is a developing network, like a methodology hub for the SRI methodology right now. They run accredited practitioner training, so there's going to be a training course on May 9th and 10th in Ottawa and on June 3rd and 4th in Saskatoon. And if you go in there and you start requesting that we need training in New Brunswick, they might be able to schedule one as well. There's also a free financial proxy database it's still very much under development, but as different individuals do SRI work, they can put those financial proxies through to the network to include on the financial proxy database. So it can give you ideas about the financial proxies. It can give you some proxies that you might need, and it's just a really good resource that way as well. And right now, they're also developing a practitioner database. So eventually, you'll be able to see who's doing SRI in Canada. Is there somebody in my community that might be able to help with this? So that was all that I had to say. I assume there's probably some questions about SRI, and I'm happy to talk through any of them. Or not. I think it would probably depend on the project, and it might be kind of further work. Like we do a lot of coaching around programs afterwards in terms of measurement and metrics. I don't know that we would really get into the program design piece, but yeah. Yeah, and they're able to identify, like pinpoint the areas where they need improvement or would like to improve. And I think that's a really great question, because that's one of the issues that comes up over and over. So maybe there's a lot of research going on in Alberta. How applicable is that to here? And I think that really depends. I'll pull proxies from Ontario to use in Alberta sometimes if I really can't find that proxy. I think it's best to have local proxies, but sometimes the research just isn't there. For example, there might be, well, I know there's a study around cost of victimization, and it's a national study around the costs of crime. And so for a local community to do that type of study and that type of research would probably be beyond the capacity, but to look at what the cost of victimization in Canada is kind of nationally, you might be able to use some of that context locally. But we usually do try and develop those proxies as locally as possible. Or it might be a matter of using some pieces of it. So for example, in Alberta, we've interviewed police officers around how long it takes them when they need to go out to a domestic call and it's, you know, a minor offense, or it's an EPO or whatever. And so maybe you could take the number of hours. You wouldn't necessarily have to go back and re-interview police officers and then say, but the cost of policing in New Brunswick is this much per hour, whereas in Alberta it was more or something. So you could maybe do a little bit of, yeah. So it's a lot of creative thinking, a lot of digging through academic research, interviews, government documents, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Oh, I think there's... The SRI Canada website or the SIMPACT? It's not up there right now. I could email it out, or we could see if, yeah, or if you contact us through the website, I can email it to you. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wondered, in regards to, again, not being just a number, if you get numbers anyway, just what do they stand for?
I think it's around that evidence-based practice. So you're demonstrating that there's actual change because of your program, and you're measuring those things, and it's not just about the stories of change, it's actually about saying X% finished high school. So you can actually have those numbers and those quantitative data also translated into financial terms, but also I would say not forgetting that context. So not just saying, we've got two different ratios. I'm just going to look at the ratios. One's 5-to-1, one's 4-to-1. We're going to fund 5-to-1. And maybe 5-to-1 was a swimming program, and 4-to-1 was a homelessness program. And so is one necessarily better than the other just because it has a higher ratio? Maybe not. Maybe they had lower investment. There's lots of reasons why ratios would be different. So it's just a matter of not just looking at that number, but also having those numbers to back up all of the stories that you're claiming, and to back up all of that, and to have evidence for all of those things that you're doing. Does that help?
It's just that, like, even within, you're using those numbers, and certain things become more important from a social aspect. If you're looking at different indices, or, you know, if you want to take a look at a different measure, some sort of metric, a year later, figure out, well, this metric's more important, then even the numbers you had for that particular one place could change again. So like, I'm just trying to figure how you would actually be able to use those numbers in any sort of quantitative manner.
Yeah, I think it would still be that sort of evaluation sort of look. So if you're saying, this year our program got $50,000 of funding and we had a return of 2-to-1, and next year we get $100,000 of funding, but our return actually is only 1.5-to-1 next year because you've got so much more funding and you actually didn't increase your activities that much or something. You would actually be able to see that. You can look at your program, within your program, year on year, and look at those metrics within one program year on year. It's just a matter of being really careful around claiming to be able to compare one type of program to another type of program where the context might be different, the demographic might be different. And it's not saying one program necessarily, or one type of program is better than another type of program. But if you're using those metrics year on year internally, that's a great way to understand internal processes, activities, what more investment means or less investment means, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it could. But I think it's still valuable to be able to do that forecasting where you're saying, if we were to establish a certain type of program in the community, and maybe you're saying it's like an employment program for disabled people. And so you're saying, okay, we know there's this need in the community. Would it be valuable to create this type of program? And so you can actually look, okay, if we helped 5 people get employed, what would that look like in terms of a $10,000 investment versus what if we got 10 people employed and we had a $70,000 investment? So you can actually play around with those numbers and understand it in a forecasting sort of way to understand what your targets might be. Yeah, understand what sorts of programs you might be wanting to set up.
Figure out like the proper investment that you need to get the best.
Yeah, and you can even look at it too in terms of how much is the minimum we'd have to invest to get a one-to-one return. Would that be enough to even run activities? That kind of stuff. So you can look at all the different elements of it and actually forecast what that value might be, and then go back later and say, okay, did we meet those targets? Did we actually achieve the value that we were hoping to achieve in our community? Yeah, not necessarily. Or for example, one program that we worked with ended up with a really, really high ratio, but it was partially because their investment was so low. But part of that story was everyone at the agency was so overworked because they were underfunded. And so they were getting great outcomes and great results, and they had tons of people going through that program, but all of their staff were like on the point of burnout. And so that was part of the story as well that they were able to say to funders. So they were able to say, look, our ratio is really high, but part of why it's so high is because we didn't get enough funding. We're operating on a shoestring. Everybody's going to quit in like 2 months. And so that's also part of the story and understanding what that ratio actually means. So they said, we'd actually rather have a lower ratio and we'd all be able to do our work in a more reasonable way if we actually had a lower ratio and had more investment in this program. Yeah.
From all the different types of programs and all the SRIs you've done on the types of programs, have you done enough to kind of be able to ballpark what the leverage on a program would be face value? Like say
Probably not.
okay.
Yeah, I think like we've done work in all sorts of different communities, all sorts of different sectors, but I don't know if there's that big enough sample size yet to do that sort of. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, if there were that many, it would be amazing. Yeah. 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 We haven't done that type of case study yet. I actually think it would be a great way to go, and we're actually working with an organization in Toronto that's asked us to consider like proposing a project around an arts program for children and youth, which is really exciting. We've also talked with Heritage Canada because they're interested in how you might measure returns on keeping heritage sites open and using them as arts programming centers and things like that. So it's definitely really possible. I haven't seen any of those case studies, but it doesn't mean that they're not out there and that it's not a great program to work with. Yeah. 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 Sure. And I don't know if Laura has a couple of examples, I think, of our workbook, just conveniently here. So it's an Excel workbook that walks you through the steps of the SRI process. I would still really recommend training around SRI before diving into it because it'll look just incomprehensible. But it does all the calculations for you. And it does provide some definitions around what do we mean when we say dead weight, or what do we mean when we say a discount rate, or whatever, like kind of that more technical aspect. It'll have some definitions in there.
I have a second question. The training that's referenced on the site as well,
Mm-hmm.
is that for interveners, or is that for people running their own organization, like to evaluate their own organization?
We do all sorts of training. So we do, like a half-day workshop, or we do 2 full days. Recently, we've done a couple of 2 full-day trainings with government, with the Northwest Territories government and with HRSDC. But we've also gone into agencies. We were recently at a seniors resource center where they have a whole bunch of different programs. They've got all their program managers to do a 2-day training to get familiar with SRI and how they might be able to use it in their programs. So it's really custom, yeah. And then there's the SET accreditation training through the SRI network, which is a program out of the UK. And it's a standardized program, and so anyone that's doing the accreditation process around the world does that same 2-day program, and then you have to submit a case study to the UK network to actually become accredited, and they have to review that case study.
Can you analyze a business idea and essentially forecast its potential social return on investment?
Yeah.
Without it being on slides?
Yeah, for sure. Especially if you have an idea of what those outcomes are going to be, or if you have best practice research, you can forecast it. And if you're pitching it or something, you would probably have to explain where all those. You'd obviously have to explain where all those numbers came from, since you're forecasting. But definitely, yeah. Well, I'll also be here, and I have cards, and yeah, thank you so much for being such a good audience.